let's go into this issue of the broader issue of existence of God. We showed a snippet of a film on DNA and how DNA cannot be formed by a chance collision of molecules.
Very good, which is exactly what they are not. Molecular structures do not form by random particles in an environment firing off and striking one another. There are forces which draw certain molecules together. We can see that happen, and we can even demonstrate it with the simple production of organic compounds in an array of conditions. This is simple chemistry at work, forming more complex biochemistry as a result.
Very powerful film. I just handed a copy to your Pastor John. And when I spoke about this a problem and was presenting all the details of it, and I hopped down from the platform, they showed this dubbed in Russian. It was dubbed in Russian 10 years ago. Film, and then I got back up on the platform. The students all of a sudden began arguing at their professor, and this lady professor kept talking, very, very strongly back to them. I said, "What is going on?" My translator said, "They want to see the whole film," and she's telling them, "Don't worry, class, I'll show the whole film next week." And I thought to myself, what an amazing picture of what we would call soft atheism. In other words, all these students, I was told, were atheists, programmed that way by their educational system in the Ukraine.
Being an atheist has nothing to do whatsoever with the factual basis of evolution. Nothing. I'm also hoping to hear the name of this video so I can do some better sourcing.
They assumed that Darwinism was a proven theory. But given some alternative evidence, some other reasons on the other side of this issue, they were wanting more information. They were not hostile. They were like sponges. And I think that's so true of many people across the world today. They just want to hear a credible case for design. Whether design involves a recent creation or an older creation, I think you could make arguments, cogent arguments on both of those sides. I happen to be viewing Genesis as historical. I don't think it's just a metaphorical or poetic presentation. But let's leaving that to one side, there are scientific issues that we will tackle very quickly.
Good. So from these students, you must understand that if they walked away after further investigation into whichever film you gave them, you still haven't given the title, accepting the factual basis for the theory of evolution over the misrepresentation of said theory offered by creationists, that the failure is on your part. The same with me here and anyone viewing this.
Let's go to the outburst in 2006, a sudden, you might say, blizzard of advertisements, of books, of TV shows, even NBC News and major newspapers got into the following three big guys, you might say. On the left, Richard Dawkins, who wrote The God Delusion. On the far right, you see Sam Harris, and his book, entitled The End of Faith, was followed up by a letter to a Christian nation, which I'm just reading. I have it here sitting on the stage. And then God is Not Great by the late Christopher Hitchens. There's about a half a dozen other major books. So what is the new atheism saying?
The exact same thing as the old atheists. They just don't have to worry as much about being hacked apart by religious fundamentalists, so can do so in a public manner far easier without more fears. That is in most cases.
One key thing, and that's no evidence for God. Well, let's take a look at this idea that they're bringing out all the time, that biblical faith is belief with no evidence. Now, if I thought that Christianity was a faith that basically said, try to just gin up, kind of screw up your courage and your confidence and your belief without evidence, I wouldn't follow that religious line of thought. If I thought that all that I had to go on was just nothing but blind hope, a leap in the dark, I wouldn't become a Christian. And I'll tell you a little bit of my story in a moment, but I think that that is the opposite of the case. Christian faith is a faith that is grounded on good evidence. Yes, we step out trusting in the Lord who revealed Himself in those evidences. But we're going to talk about the evidence tonight. And specifically, I would take anybody right away to the DBR. Now, have you ever heard that phrase? DBR. Christ's death, burial, resurrection.
So you will take us to a non-historical story which has not been verified by a single secular source or piece of evidence. I can see this going very well.
And we could add the E if we wanted to, because they're eyewitnesses. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 1 and 7 is where we see the DBR most powerfully presented. And Paul there not only talks about Christ dying for us, for our sins, paying the penalty, but he says he was raised and he was seen by Peter, he was seen by James, he was seen by all the apostles, and then again by all the apostles, with Thomas present, we know from the book of John. And he goes into this tremendously powerful list.
Oh yes, and I saw Godzilla in the River Thames in London during the student protest. Everyone saw it. It was pretty hard to miss. So all 8.3 million plus Londoners saw it. That's far more eyewitnesses than the Bible ever had. Do you see what I'm doing? I am one person claiming 8.3 million people were witnesses. I am not 8.3 million witnesses. I don't know if you noticed that. The apostles had something to gain, even in preserving their unfounded beliefs, i.e. in lying. We know today just what extent people will go to lie for comfort. However, witnesses are not the valuable individuals in court cases you seem to think. Certainly not ones millennia ago. Today in trials and court cases, witnesses are taken with a pinch of salt, as the human mind is excellent at contorting reality to suggestion, both external, as with another person, or internal, as with a person's confirmation bias. This really isn't good evidence.
You know, that was written in a genuine letter by Paul in 56 AD. It's dated to 33 AD.
And yet none of the letters were written any younger than 50 AD, given the most generous of estimates, regardless of your claims of dating to 30 AD. They were written a relative lifetime after Christ's apparent death. Can you remember what happened 50 years ago? I'm not buying into it.
In the original formulation of that list. So we're talking about evidence that's early. It's close to the event itself. It's not put together. It's not a legend. It's not a myth developed over decades. It's early as the headline news or a banner that runs across the bottom of your TV screen from some news service.
50 plus years is more than 10 years, therefore, yes, it was constructed over decades. Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers was a TV show which first aired in 1989, and one of the main characters was the engineer Gadget Hackwrench, who now has their own cult in Russia. Now, how serious are these people? I don't know. It could just be a laugh. But in 20 years, they became well known around 2010. They have created a cult around a cartoon character. Now, imagine what could happen in a world before education, where word of mouth is the primary source of information, and there's talk of a charismatic individual by the name Christ. That could get out of hand pretty quickly.
And so we have tremendous biblical faith, but I can hear Richard Dawkins saying, that's just biased reporters. Those are people who had their lives were changed somehow, and they just went with this one side. Well, everybody knows that you're going to make a decision for or against this new message, right? If it's a life-changing message, you either have to believe it or reject it. And so to say we need unbiased, witnesses is absurd demand.
How about any source which is not part of Scripture? I mean, take this passage from the Bible, for example. Matthew chapter 27, verses 52 through 53. And the tombs broke open, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. It includes they appeared to many people. This exists nowhere in recorded history from any of the Roman scholars at the time. The dead walked the earth, and nobody thought it significant enough to write down. That is why Dawkins and the other skeptics are justified in holding doubt, whether or not you childishly call the request for evidence absurd.
Talk about the more gentle or subtle type of evidence. Joy, according to C.S. Lewis. You ever heard of C.S. Lewis? Okay, Oxford, Cambridge professor later on.
So that was it. The evidence of the resurrection which you wish to present to people who doubt the credibility of the Bible was the Bible. As for C.S. Lewis, yes, I've heard of him. He was a mediocre writer of fiction. Only the settings and the mythological characters and creatures offered his work salvation. Do pardon the pun. This is why it exists that C.S. Lewis breaks the trend that typically the book is superior to the film. The movies are much more bearable in my eyes. I just have to say it. Sadly, from what I've seen of his work on theology, being the poor thinker's philosophy, it was worse yet. I'm actually pretty sick of C.S. Lewis and would appreciate if someone could beat me over the head repeatedly to save me from this experience. Any takers?
He died the same day that President Kennedy was assassinated. Did you know that? Interesting little fact. November 22nd, 63. I was sitting in junior high history class of all places. I'll never forget it, but I didn't know that this famous Oxford professor had died the same day. Well, his life for 20 years was that of a running atheist. He was running from God. Lewis presented reasons for faith about 10 years later. After he rejected his atheism and became a follower of Christ, he presented on BBC radio one night a week for a period of 5 weeks in 1941. He presented his case, and he actually was going to call it the art of being shocked. They didn't use that phrase, but I think it's a cool phrase. Do you like that? The art of being shocked. I think it's wonderful. And what he meant is there are reasons for the skeptic, for the secular person who's just dismissed God, there are reasons for them to really, if you look at it, to be shocked. For example, he says that right and wrong is a key question. Is there objective right and wrong? Are there values and absolutes out there? And he says if you look at it carefully, everybody believes that, let's say, rape is wrong, that child torturing babies for the fun of it is a horrific thing. Racial siding with one race, trying to kill Jews by the thousands or millions is a horrific travesty and blotch on human history.
Someone has clearly never read the Bible. So you think that everyone views genocide, i.e. the systematic slaughter of a specific demographic, e.g. in this case, a specific people from the Middle East, is wrong. What about all those tribes Moses himself was apparently tasked with wiping off the face of the earth? So you think that rape, especially child rape, was always viewed in this way as well? Well, in the case of the Midianites, after the full-grown men were slaughtered and the women and the young boys had been taken hostage, God commands the death of every male and every woman who has seen the touch of a man, keeping the virgin girls to be raped and married off among the Hebrews. Why do I bring this up? How is this relevant? Well, it displays a disconnect, a moral inconsistency between what you and C.S. Lewis are saying and what your apparent God commands. All this actually shows is that we can eliminate morality as being sourced from the God of the Bible. If it is objective, it cannot come from there due to the before-mentioned example contradicting it. If it is subjective, then we need to discuss the nature of that subjectivity apart from a deity. Either way, you have no argument to stand on.
Those things are objectively wrong, and we all know it down deep. Well, if there are objective moral values, then God must exist, and he proved that through his opening section of Mere Christianity. And then he began to talk about the shock of Jesus' remarks about himself. We're going to be talking about that in just a moment. I think that I would like to share my story because you may say, is this valid? Do these reasons really have an impact? Well, they impacted me back when I was 19. Let's show what I look like. That's me at age 19, a freshman at Princeton University. And I was an atheist at the time. I was wanting to prove to everybody I could that Darwin was right. And if you were a Christian trying to promote your creation stuff, well then get with it. Wake up, smell the coffee, right? Smell the roses. And Darwin was right. And it was through a loving group of students and one graduate who would spend time with me, patiently reading Scripture with me, sharing with me his faith, that after a period of 6 months, at the end of my freshman year, I realized that it was true, that Christ was who he claimed to be, that I did have a need, I was a sinner, and I received Christ, and at that point my life changed completely. I was still a Darwinist for about 6 months. I still believed that, well, God worked through Darwinian evolution, but then that, as I looked at the evidence in that area, that changed as well.
You are not telling the truth. How do I know? Well, the theory of evolution is not linked to a lack of belief in a deity in any way. Ergo, you are either lying about being an atheist or lying about what you were as an atheist. You could have been an atheist who accepted science, but that being an atheist would not have any effect in promoting science. That is outside the possibility of people turning up to your house with lit torches, and you need to convince them that you are not a devil worshipper.
So that's where we're going to talk about, is initially just some of the biblical reasons for faith, and then we'll go back into this issue. Well, says, Richard Dawkins, you can't go with that. One of my favorite places in the Bible is Acts 26:26. You know what I like? Is when the Bible has the same chapter and the same verse. 26:26. Say that with me. 26:26. So Acts 26:26 is where Paul, he's in house arrest in the city of Caesarea Philippi, not too far from the Mediterranean coast. And he's being pulled into something like a Senate hearing, like we would have today in the U.S. Congress, where a famous person who's been doing something weird, and they bring him in and they put him at a panel, and all the senators are up there investigating what has happened. And so in front of Festus, and these are all Roman authorities, the king Herod and his wife, Herod Agrippa, are there. And Luke vindicates Paul's testimony. Now, what is Luke's purpose? Luke shows throughout the book of Acts where Paul presented the truth of the Christian faith in front of the top intellectual and political authorities of the Roman Empire. I think that's kind of cool, don't you? It's like Paul is invited to go to Congress. Paul is invited to go to Wall Street. Paul is invited to go to Harvard University. They're interrogating him, and he's giving powerful evidential basis for the Christian faith. That's throughout the book of Acts. Acts is spectacular in that regard.
And yet notice that Rome was not Christianized until after 3rd century AD. What does this tell you about the effectiveness of Paul's claims?
Well, what do they say? Well, at the one point, Festus, the Roman governor, says, "Paul, you're out of your mind!" And that is both a gesture and a signature of the next point. This was not done in a corner, Paul says. What does he mean by that? This was done under the glare of the authorities of the Roman Empire. They know all about this, and you might even describe this as an X-File. Have you ever seen that movie or the movies? There was a TV series as well, The X-Files. Remember Mulder and Scully, the woman agent, said, oh, she's always figuring things are just, scientifically provable. Mulder says, no, there's something spooky, there's something real. Maybe it's ETs, who knows about the plots of those programs. But I'm trying to bring out the parallel here. This was an unsolved governmental X-file that they could never get to the bottom of. And the reason is that God intervened and raised Jesus from the dead.
Or could it be that just possibly, like the fictitious example of conspiracy you used, this was equally fictitious, i.e., the claims of Paul had no weight if they were ever given in this manner? I'm now over 20 minutes in, and I'm still waiting for some evidence.
No one stole the body. There wasn't a mistake about the tomb. He was seen by eyewitnesses, and his body's, if you will, empty cavity, something like a cocoon, left over from those strips of cloth, as if the mummy was there, and then the mummy just vanished and passed right through the cloths. Of course, the mummy is not a mummy, but the raised body of Jesus. And so we see, I would say, the example here in Acts 26:26 of the ultimate X-file. Well, let's move on. Let's think in terms of the strangeness that Lewis would point to. All the time, Lewis would point in many of his writings to the strange claims, the shocking remarks. He calls it appalling remarks. I didn't want to use the word appalling. I don't think they're appalling. Well, I guess you could say they're appalling if you're thinking that Jesus is just a nice little moral teacher. But when Jesus says, I am the ultimate source of moral wisdom of the entire universe, an ordinary, sane person doesn't say that if they're just a nice moral teacher. Either he's far less than a good moral teacher, or he's far more than just a mere moral teacher. Either he's the God of heaven and earth who created us, or he's a liar or a madman. And this is the argument that Lewis uses with great effectiveness. Why does he say that? Because Lewis could say that because the statements of Jesus are just shocking. Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am. John chapter 8, verse 58. Truly, truly, it means it's an important statement. Listen up, guys. Before Abraham was. That's, prior to, that pre-existence of Abraham. That means if this is 30 or 33, depending on which date you take, go back to the time of Abraham. When is that? 2000 BC. So he says, before Abraham, I've been around, I've been active. And he says, not I was. What is the phrase he used? I am. I am is the clear-cut verbal statement of Yahweh, the name of the Old Testament God. So he's actually, as it were, killing two birds with one stone. He's proving 2 points with one statement. And it's a very powerful statement. Let's bring another one. Oh, it's already up. Jesus says, of course, to Martha, at this point Mary has joined them. Lazarus is in the tomb. And he says very powerfully and very encouragingly, I am the resurrection and the life. And then he goes on and says, he who believes in me shall live even if he dies, and everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. I remember hearing that when I was in high school. I was still an agnostic. I was sliding toward atheism. I was getting ready to go off to Princeton. It was my great goal of life to go attend this Ivy League university and become a chemist or a doctor. And I remember hearing that, and as an agnostic who didn't believe in miracles, I was just shocked. It just hit me to the core of my being, and I'm thinking, I really did fear death, not as much as I did when, as a college freshman, my friends were being shot up in the rice paddies of Vietnam and giving their lives. And their bodies were being shipped back one by one to Columbus, Ohio. But I remember thinking, wow, if that is true, that changes everything. If what Jesus said there is absolutely rock solid, verifiably true, then I don't have to fear death ever if I could have a relationship with Him. I didn't maybe think it in those terms, but I remember just being staggered at the thought that's contained in that promise. Well, let's go ahead and just bring in how the new atheist might attack. The new atheist would say, oh, you don't need to think anything about this. Richard Dawkins, for example, says Jesus probably just was misled. Sincerely misled. Let's think about that for just a moment. Does that make sense? Jesus had a lot of nice teachings, but when it came to calling Himself God, He was just a little bit off. If I said that I created the universe and all of you 10 minutes ago, and I created you with all the memories that you think you have these memories, and I just created you with those memories intact, you would go call the psychiatric, agents of Honolulu or this area, because I surely should go into a mental ward. Jesus could not have been just sincerely misled. 2 seconds later in the same book, The God Delusion, he says, well, he probably never said those things in the first place. What is his basis for that? He spends no time, just blurts out, well, he probably never said that. Oh, so all the disciples just gave their lives for a lie? They risked their lives for a concocted lie? And all the disciples made up a story about the women coming to the tomb? I mean, if I was going to make up a story about Jesus, I would have the bold, courageous disciples discovering, right? Not the disciples cowering behind closed doors, locked doors, and it was the women. much to the chagrin and embarrassment of the disciples, the women who had the boldness to go. No, the women who could not be legal authorities in any kind of testimony, in any trial or hearing at that time. It was the women. Yay, women. Okay. It was the women who went and who discovered the body and who had the first contact with Jesus. I say, good for them. That story would never be invented, and we all know it. Then that's why it rings with utter, salient truth, bedrock, factual truth. So, the idea that Jesus was sincerely misled, ridiculous.
You know, as poor as this argument, aka the Lewis's trilemma, is, I'm glad you have brought it up so that I may finally put a bullet in it. The slides that appear on screen come from a talk given by Peter S. Williams here at the University of Surrey, the same talk which I began to take apart in an uncompleted series, links down below. Beyond Person X says this was the last actual argument that could be offered, so thank you for giving me the opportunity to lay it to rest. But first of all, I need to point something out. Christ's teachings were ahead of his time. The key word is ahead. That does not make them amazing teachings beyond anything we have seen in ethics. Not even close. Jesus was, by today's standards, a rather close-minded hypocrite in many different ways. A select few good snippets here and there in the Bible, some added long after the original writings or even the first canonization, does not change that. But let us pretend that the writings do apparently show a man of such advanced levels of ethics. Let's pretend that, okay? So now back to Lewis's trilemma. My first answer would be this. Jesus never said any of those things. There are no secular sources for Christ's existence, let alone the notion that he said these things in these specific words. These writings, none any earlier than 50 AD, can simply be removed from the discussion, and I can just avoid the other factors. I don't have to actually discuss them, because you have to prove that Christ actually said these things, which you have not. Therefore, yeah, maybe the gospel writers lied about more than just their identities. But as easy as that is just to leave it there, I'm going to go on, because there is more. Moving on to the idea that Jesus could not have been a liar, this comes from the fallacious notion that there is something innately wrong with lying, and extending from that, the other fallacious notion that if a person does something wrong, suddenly they are incapable of doing something right. On to the first. Lying is not always wrong. Lying can be justified. People may ask me, well, how do you know? My mother's side of the family lived on the Dutch-German border in Holland, which came under Nazi occupation. They supported the resistance efforts to liberate the Netherlands. Part and parcel of that was lying to the Nazi occupiers. There is nothing to be forgiven in this, period. So if Jesus saw that he would have difficulty getting his genuine message out without lying, the means could be argued to justify the end. Secondly, doing a single bad thing is not the defining point of your life. People are capable of both good and bad within a single lifetime. As for him being in captions a lunatic, as Lewis describes him, this is incredibly ableist language. People who have some form of psychopathology are not merely half-baked, unthinking vegetables. Take, for example, people with specific forms of autism, which gives them the inability to process emotions in the general manner. These people make some of the greatest scientists, researchers, lecturers, etc., as it is nigh impossible to emotionally warp reality to fool them. This is why, even though not all atheists have a form of autism, we do find that a large proportion of autistic individuals do have an absence of theistic belief, because they cannot be emotionally blindsided. So there could have been something that affected the mind of a man called Jesus. That does not suddenly mean that his life or his sayings would be unobtainable or void of value. And it's insulting to state otherwise. And last of all, as for honestly mistaken, we are talking about a period without access to good education, communication, and the scientific method, growing up in a time where a lot of unknown phenomenon was attributed to gods and spirits. What is more is that even with access to these things, some people show great disconnect between fields, e.g., Isaac Newton's ideas on alchemy were ludicrous, yet this has no effect upon his other fields of work and how good a man he was in science. So there you have it, Lewis's trilemma shot down. And with that done, I think it's time for another break.